In 1944, Hitler waited for Patton's million-man army to strike at Calais. But the tanks were rubber. The soldiers were ghosts. And the lie had to hold.
In the spring of 1944, on a quiet stretch of the English coast facing Nazi-occupied France, a German reconnaissance plane flew high over the county of Kent and photographed something that should have terrified Berlin. Spread across the fields below were the staging grounds of a vast invasion force. Hundreds of Sherman tanks lined up in motor parks, fleets of landing craft crowding the inlets, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, oil storage tanks, the unmistakable footprint of an entire army group waiting to strike at Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. The commander of this colossal force was George Patton, the most aggressive general the Allies had, exactly the man you would send to lead the main blow. German intelligence studied the photographs, counted the tanks, and reached the obvious conclusion: the invasion would land at Calais. They were wrong about all of it. The tanks were made of rubber and could be lifted by 4 men. The landing craft were canvas stretched over scaffolding, floating on oil drums. The fuel depot was painted plywood. Patton commanded an army that did not exist, of 1 million men who were never born. And it may have been the most important army of the entire war. So how do you defend a coastline or win a continent with weapons that aren't real? The trick is older than the cannons it imitates, and to understand the ghost armies of the Second World War, you have to go back to the men who first painted logs black and pointed them at an enemy. The technique even has a name, and the name is a joke. They were called Quaker guns, after the famously pacifist religious sect that refused to bear real weapons. A Quaker gun was a log, cut to the rough length and diameter of an artillery piece, often mounted on real wheels, sometimes charred or painted black at the muzzle end, and set behind a fortification so that an enemy peering through a spyglass would count it as a working cannon. It cost nothing. It could not fire. And used correctly, it could freeze an entire army in place. During the American Revolution, the defenders of more than one position bluffed the British with logs. But it was the American Civil War that turned the Quaker gun into an art form, and the master of it was a Confederate general named Joseph Johnston, and later, most famously, the defenders of the lines at Centerville and Manassas. In the winter of 1861 and into 1862, the Confederate Army holding the lines in Northern Virginia was badly outnumbered by the Union forces gathering around Washington, so the Confederates lined their earthworks with Quaker guns, logs shaped and painted to look like heavy artillery, bristling from every embrasure. Union Commander George McClellan, a brilliant organizer and a famously cautious man, looked at those fortifications through his field glasses, counted the guns, and saw a position far too strong to assault. He delayed. He called for more men, more time, more preparation. And when the Union Army finally advanced on the Confederate works in March of 1862, they found the lines abandoned. The Confederates had slipped away days earlier, and the terrible artillery that had held the most powerful army in North America at bay turned out to be painted tree trunks. Northern newspapers were merciless. They printed cartoons of McClellan recoiling from logs. The general's reputation never fully recovered, and a quiet lesson was filed away in the world's military academies. A weapon does not have to be real to be effective. It only has to be believed. That lesson slept for 2 generations, and then the largest war in human history gave it a stage no one could have imagined. By the time of the Second World War, deception was no longer about a few painted logs. It had become an industrial discipline run by intelligence services, staffed by magicians, artists, and engineers, and capable of conjuring entire armies out of rubber, canvas, and radio static. And nowhere was this practiced with more imagination than among the Allies, who built two of the most extraordinary deception units that ever existed, a British and American partnership of strategic illusion that would reach its peak in the deception that protected D-Day, and a small American unit, barely 1,000 men strong, that spent the war impersonating divisions 20 times its size on the battlefields of Europe. If you are enjoying this story, take a second and hit subscribe. We cover history's forgotten weapons and most unbelievable deceptions every single week. That small American unit had a bland, forgettable name, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. History remembers them by a better one, the Ghost Army. They were activated in 1944, around 1,100 men, and they were unlike any combat unit the U.S. Army had ever fielded, because most of them could not have been less like soldiers. The recruiters had gone looking for talent in art schools, advertising agencies, and engineering programs. Their ranks included the future fashion designer Bill Blass, the painter and abstract artist Ellsworth Kelly, the wildlife illustrator Arthur Singer, and dozens of other artists, designers, and sound engineers who had traded their drawing boards for a uniform. Their mission was to impersonate other, much larger American units, to appear wherever the real army wanted the Germans to think it was strong, and to vanish wherever the real army actually was. They had three kinds of magic, and they used all of them together. The first was sight. The Ghost Army carried inflatable tanks, trucks, jeeps, and artillery, full-size dummies of rubber that a few men could carry and inflate with compressors or even bicycle pumps. From a low-flying aircraft or a distant ridge, a field of these inflatables looked exactly like an armored division parked for the night. The artists arranged them with a craftsman's eye. Tank tracks pressed into the mud with special tools, fake supply dumps, the carefully staged clutter of a real encampment. They even simulated sloppiness, because a too-perfect camp looked fake. The second kind of magic was sound. A team had gone to Fort Knox and recorded the noises of armored and infantry units, then mixed them onto state-of-the-art records. The audio of tanks moving, bridges being built, men shouting, engines idling. Mounted on half-tracks with enormous speakers, this sonic deception could be heard 15 miles away. On a dark night, a German listening post would hear an entire armored column assembling in the woods, when in truth, there was nothing there but a few men and a phonograph. The third kind of magic was the airwaves. Radio operators learned to impersonate the specific Morse code style, the fist, of operators in real units, then transmitted a convincing stream of fake traffic, the radio chatter of thousands of men who weren't there. But the Ghost Army's finest hour was not its own. Its techniques, and the techniques of its British counterparts, were folded into something far larger, an operation whose entire purpose was to win the most important day of the war by making sure the German army was looking the wrong way. It was called Operation Fortitude, and it was the deception arm of the D-Day invasion. The Allies faced a brutal problem. They were going to land at Normandy in June 1944. But the most obvious, most defensible, most expected landing site was the Pas de Calais, where the channel is narrowest. The Germans knew it, and they had concentrated their strongest forces there, including the formidable 15th Army. If those divisions rushed to Normandy in the first hours of the invasion, the landings would be crushed on the beaches. So the Allies set out to do the impossible. They would convince Hitler that Normandy was the fake, and Calais was the real thing, and they would keep convincing him of it even after Allied troops were dying on the Normandy sand. The centerpiece was a phantom army called the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly massing in southeast England, directly across from Calais. On paper, it was enormous, perhaps 1 million men. In reality, it was almost entirely fiction. The fields of Kent and Essex filled with inflatable Sherman tanks and dummy landing craft built of canvas and scaffolding, arranged just carelessly enough to fool the German aerial reconnaissance that the Allies deliberately allowed to get through. Plywood oil docks, designed by a famous British architect and stage designers, sprawled along the coast, complete with fake anti-aircraft guns and wind effects to stir the dust. And tying it all together was a torrent of fake radio traffic, the same trick the Ghost Army used, broadcasting the daily life of 1 million imaginary soldiers into the air for German codebreakers to intercept. To command this army of ghosts, the Allies appointed the one general the Germans feared and respected above all others, George Patton. The Germans were certain that wherever Patton was, the main attack would follow. So the Allies put their most dangerous commander in charge of their least real army, and let German intelligence draw the conclusion they wanted. And then there was the human layer, the part that made the illusion unbreakable. The Germans believed they were running a network of spies in Britain. In fact, British intelligence had captured or turned every single German agent in the country, and was feeding them all false information in a masterpiece of counter-espionage called the double-cross system. The most important of these double agents was a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, who had built up such credibility with his German handlers that they trusted him completely. Garbo and his fictional network of 27 sub-agents, almost all invented, sent the Germans a steady stream of reports confirming the existence of FUSAG and the coming blow at Calais. The illusion was now total. Fake tanks the Germans could photograph, fake radio traffic they could intercept, and fake spy reports from a source they trusted with their lives, all telling the same lie. On the 6th of June 1944, the real invasion hit the beaches of Normandy. And here the deception did the thing that deceptions almost never do. It held. Even as reports flooded in that the Allies were ashore in Normandy in enormous strength, the German High Command, primed for months to expect Calais, concluded that Normandy was exactly what they had been warned about: a diversion, a feint designed to pull their reserves away from the real target. 2 days after D-Day, with the Normandy beachhead still desperately fragile, Hitler ordered 2 powerful SS Panzer divisions that had been moving toward Normandy to turn around and return to the Pas de Calais, to wait for the main attack from Patton's army group, the blow that never came. Garbo himself sent the message that helped freeze them, warning his handlers that Normandy was a trap and the real assault was still to come. The powerful 15th Army sat in Calais for weeks, guarding against a ghost, while the Allies poured men and tanks into Normandy and clawed out the foothold that would eventually liberate Western Europe. By the time the Germans understood that Normandy was the real invasion, it was far too late to throw it back into the sea. The Ghost Army, meanwhile, took its rubber tanks and its records and its radios across the Channel and went to war for real, running more than 20 separate deception operations across France, Belgium, and Germany. Again and again, they impersonated divisions, drawing German attention and fire toward empty fields, while the real units they imitated slipped away to attack elsewhere. The work was more dangerous than it sounds. To be convincing, they had to operate close to the front, sometimes in front of the real lines, broadcasting the sounds of an army they did not have and praying the Germans did not call the bluff with a real attack. Their most daring operation came in March 1945 on the Rhine. Operation Viersen saw barely 1,000 men impersonate 2 entire divisions, some 30,000 troops, with inflatable tanks, sound effects, and fake radio nets, pulling German attention away from the actual Rhine crossing point. It worked. The crossing succeeded, and the Ghost Army's illusions had helped open the road into the heart of Germany. But here is the strangest part of the whole story. After the war, the Ghost Army vanished, not in battle, but into silence. Their work was so sensitive and so useful that the US Army classified the entire operation and ordered the men to say nothing. Many of the deception techniques would be used again in Korea and the Cold War, so the secret held. These soldiers came home from the war and could not tell anyone what they had done. Men who had helped save thousands of lives at Normandy sat through decades of family dinners, listening to others describe ordinary combat, unable to say that they had fought the war with paintbrushes and loudspeakers and inflatable tanks. The record stayed sealed for more than 50 years. It was not until 1996 that the operation was finally declassified, and the surviving members of the Ghost Army could at last tell their families what those bland orders in 1944 had really meant. In 2022, nearly 80 years after they inflated their first rubber tank, the unit was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor Congress can give. By then, almost all of them were gone, and the deeper lesson outlived all of them, because it had been true since the first log was painted black and pointed at the British. A weapon's power lives partly in the mind of the enemy who sees it. McClellan was not beaten by Confederate cannons. He was beaten by his own certainty about what those shapes in the embrasures must be. Hitler was not beaten at Calais by Patton's army group. He was beaten by his own conviction that a man like Patton must be leading the real attack, and that the obvious target must be the true one. The Ghost Army and the architects of Fortitude understood something McClellan's tormentors had grasped 80 years earlier. You do not have to build a real army if you can build a real belief. The enemy's own intelligence, his own logic, his own caution, become the weapons you turn against him. The most expensive divisions in the German order of battle in the summer of 1944 were spent guarding a coastline against 1 million men made of rubber and radio waves and a single brilliant lie. So the next time you imagine the machinery that won the Second World War, the tanks and the bombers and the battleships, remember that some of the most decisive weapons of that war could be carried by 4 men, inflated with a bicycle pump, and folded back into a truck by morning. Remember the artists and the ad men and the sound engineers who held the line with illusions, and the soldiers 80 years before them who froze an army with painted logs. They never fired a shot, and they helped win a war. If this story pulled you in, subscribe and drop a like so more people can find this channel. And tell us in the comments, which fake army would have fooled you? The painted logs at Manassas or the rubber tanks aimed at Calais?